Good afternoon, and welcome to today's installment of ACS's Book Talk series, a discussion of Dollars for Life, the Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment by Mary Ziegler. I'm Lindsay Langholz, Senior Director of Policy and Program at ACS, the country's foremost progressive legal network with more than 250 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. ACS's mission is to shape legal debate, nurture the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensure the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. If you aren't already, I'd encourage you to become a member of ACS. Go to acslaw.org, where you can join and find more information about events like this one and see the complete list of books on our fall reading list. I'd also encourage you to follow ACS on social media. A few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. This afternoon's discussion is being recorded, and the recording will be available on ACS's website after today's program concludes. There will be a time at the end of today's discussion for audience questions. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Do not use the chat to ask your questions, as we won't be looking at it and your question will not make it into the queue. I am honored and excited to welcome Professor Mary Ziegler to discuss her book this afternoon. She is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law and an expert on the law, history, and politics of reproduction, healthcare, and conservatism in the United States from 1945 to the present. She's one of the world's leading historians of the US abortion debate and the author of several other books, including Abortion and the Law in America, Beyond Abortion, and the award-winning After Roe, The Lost History of the Abortion Debate. She speaks frequently with the media, including The Atlantic, Fox News, MSNBC, The New Republic, New York Times, NPR, Washington Post, and so many more. There's so much more I could say about Professor Ziegler and her work, but like me, I imagine you are eager to hear directly from her. So allow me to say welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Ziegler.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay.
Oh, we're delighted. You know, this book talk is coming in December. In a few short weeks, we will mark 50 years since the Supreme Court issued its landmark opinion in Roe v. Wade, recognizing a federal constitutional right to abortion, which, as we all know, the court overturned last term in a case called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. For those of us who work in the reproductive rights space or even just have a passion about the issue, there's a question we hear often, which is, how did we get here? And your book does such an amazing job of getting us closer to an answer to that huge question. I want to give you a chance first just to explain the book, what it discusses, and what prompted you to take up this particular piece of legal and political history.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent there's a sort of simple answer to how we got here, I think that it has to be one not about substantive arguments, right? Because I think the arguments that folks in the anti-abortion movement have made really haven't changed a whole lot since the 1960s, or at least since the 1980s. So the arguments that, you know, the court made in Dobbs are not new arguments. They've been in amicus briefs for a long time. They've been in law review articles for a long time. I mean, there are portions of Alito's opinion that could have been lifted from, you know, our law review articles written in the 80s about, you know, how to overturn Roe v. Wade. So to me, it's very much instead a story about how a social movement, you know, transformed our party system, transformed the way money in politics works. And I think in some ways now is working to change how voting works. Some of the major players in the anti-abortion debate are now also major players in efforts, for example, to curtail mail-in voting or introduce other restrictions on voting. So I think this is a story about how the fight to change the rules on abortion turned into a kind of fight to change the way democracy works in ways that have had, and I think will continue to have, knock-on effects for people who don't care about this issue, right? And I think if we're being honest, there are a lot of people I know, even people who identify as progressives or would be sympathetic to organizations like ACS, who essentially say, well, this is, you know, this is not really my problem, right? Like, I can't get pregnant, or I'm too old to be pregnant, or you know, it's just somebody else's issue. And I think that the changes that were wrought by the campaign to change the law on Roe really challenges that narrative. I mean, I didn't know Roe. This book came out, I think, about a week before Roe was overturned. So I didn't know Roe was going to be overturned, although we accelerated the timeline for the book when it started to look like that was going to happen. But I, as someone who's studied this my whole career and written a lot of books on the history of this, I was fairly confident that Roe would be overturned at some point once I had a sense of who was on the court. And I started to be intrigued, a book or two before this about why anti-abortion groups were involved so much in campaign finance, because that isn't intuitively very logical, right? These are not groups that have a lot of money historically. Now they're starting to have more, right? But in the 80s and 90s, these were not groups that could compete with the likes of the Koch brothers, right? Or for-profit corporations. And so more money in politics instinctually made me think that would hurt them, right? They would be getting drowned out by nonprofits and super PACs and other organizations, even in the pre-super PAC and nonprofit era, with more money. So I was just intrigued as to why they were doing, like, what was the point of that? So it started with that mystery, and then it also started just with my, I think, fortuitous access to a lot of information other people didn't have. Throughout my career, I've always been able to get people who don't agree with me at all to trust me with their stories and their papers. And so Jim Bopp, who's one of the main characters in the book, we'll talk about him in a minute, had called me several years before I started writing the book and said, I know who you are. I know that you support abortion rights and reproductive justice. I have a file on you. And he does. I have a file on me. I've never reviewed the whole thing. And he said, I think this history is important. I think you're the person, you're the sort of historian of this generation. And I want you to have access to it. And so I went out to Terre Haute, Indiana, and, went to his office and have had access to the material since then. So I think it was, I wanted to write a book that sort of made sense of this conundrum, but I also had the ability to. And then I think I was able, not just through this connection to him, but other activists that I got to know through other books. And then there's a sort of snowball effect that if people trust you to tell their stories, other people trust you to tell their stories, because otherwise it's always, if I'm being frank, a little mysterious to me why, entirely why people trust you, but they have, and I'm grateful for that, because I think it's important to know the extent to which this is a democracy story. It's obviously a story about people who can get pregnant. It's obviously a story about what's happened to them in the aftermath of Dobbs, but it's bigger than that, right? I think that what needed to change for this to happen was even bigger than that.
I'd love to keep with Jim Bopp. There's so many people in the book that throughout that are going to be familiar names to readers, including our own Russ Feingold, who makes plenty appearances. But Jim Bopp may not be a name that comes across people's radar as often. And so would you mind explaining a little bit about both who he is and what his role has been, in particular, how he came to be a crusader against campaign finance laws, because that's not where he started.
Yeah, I mean, so Bopp, if you've heard of Bopp, you may have heard of Bopp, right? So he was the lawyer who kind of launched initially the Citizens United litigation. He's the general counsel for the National Right to Life Committee, which is one of the largest national anti-abortion groups, and historically, I would say probably the most influential anti-abortion group. There's the anti-abortion movement right now, there's a real battle for power. And so who's the most powerful national group now is like, that's a whole separate conversation. But as general counsel, he's been very influential in the movement. He's been very influential in the Republican National Committee. At various points, he's been the general counsel for the RNC. He's routinely involved in kind of internal Republican Party machinations, like at the Republican National Convention. He had a hand really in writing the anti-abortion plank of the Republican platform every year going back to the 80s when the Republican Party first adopted that kind of plank. Personality-wise, you may have heard of him recently because he was in the news when a 10-year-old girl traveled to Indiana after she'd been sexually assaulted to end her pregnancy, and Bopp, essentially went to the media saying, that abortion should have been criminalized, even though the child was only 10 years old, and he kind of made headlines again about that. He also was pretty heavily involved in the early efforts to overturn the 2020 election. He eventually bowed out of those cases, but had filed early on some lawsuits to challenge the results in key states that would have effectively overturned the 2020 election. So if you've heard of him, you probably heard of him for all of these reasons. He's an interesting figure because while he's certainly a true believer, he also is kind of a political junkie and a consummate strategist in a way you don't find with everyone in the movement. Like, he loves winning, right? He loves kind of outmatching and outthinking opponents. And so it's not surprising that someone like that would land on campaign finance as a strategy. It's also important to know that he was a Republican before he was in the anti-abortion movement, right? Like, his sort of earliest memories of sort of caring about anything were, caring about Barry Goldwater, right? And caring about abortion came later. And so I think he was always interested in how to change the GOP, how to bring together his two loves, so sort of the anti-abortion movement and the GOP, which had been estranged. And I think how he got into campaign finance really happened after Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Up until that time, people in the anti-abortion movement, and I think this went for a lot of other grassroots right-wing movements, thought essentially the way you get whatever you want is that you get Republicans elected, and then Republicans put the justices you want on the bench, and that's all you need. And it turned out that that wasn't true, of course, because you had Republican nominees like Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy and David Souter writing a joint opinion in Casey to save abortion rights. And so the question became, well, what could the movement do to prevent another Casey from happening, or to move beyond Casey? And the answer, in part, at least for BOP, had to do with money, right? That the movement would have to, and money in different ways, right? I thought that more money in politics would mean, or more money in politics would allow the anti-abortion movement to purchase more influence and access in the party. It would allow the anti-abortion movement to prove its worth to the Republican Party at a time kind of like now, when polls were bad for the anti-abortion movement, when gubernatorial races and state legislative races were punishing politicians who opposed abortion rights. Essentially, the anti-abortion movement was saying, look, even if abortion is a losing issue for you, we're not partners you want to let go of, because we can help you get around the campaign finance rules that exist and to beat your opponents by simply outspending them. So there was an element of that too. And eventually, I think it didn't start out this way, but eventually people in the movement began to see money in politics as a way to change the balance of power in the GOP away from what we would consider kind of the establishment, people who had traditionally held power in the movement, whether that was committeemen, donors, kind of like perennial figures in the party, to move power away from those people and toward much more ideologically absolutist and sometimes radical movements. And so I think all three, money became, and it still is, I think, I think this is ongoing. And one of the reasons you see so much emphasis on dark money, because it became not just about money, but secrecy in spending.
Well, and one of the things that you highlight in the book that I thought was so important, sometimes gets overlooked, is not only did it allow money to flood in from outside groups like anti-abortion groups, but it also, with that flood, kept the establishment from being able to control how the money was spent, control how everybody was interacting with each other within the GOP and the political process. And so you really saw this just kind of flattening of the structure in a way that just didn't exist before, that allowed some of these groups to really step up and push candidates that were far more in line with what they actually were asking for.
Yeah. I mean, one of the stories that was the most compelling when I was in the archive was just the difference between Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump. So when Pat Buchanan was running, some of you may know he was a very kind of Trump-like figure. The base of the GOP loved him. He was sort of similarly kind of good TV, if that's how your taste ran. Like, he would wave a pitchfork, he would say ridiculous things, he would like make fun of his opponents. It was eerily like Trump. And he also did really well in a lot of the primaries in 1996, and he was running against a kind of lackluster, not super charismatic candidate in Bob Dole. And there was, at the time, because most money was soft money that ran through the GOP structure, eventually the party looked at this and said, Pat Buchanan is unelectable, and they just spent him out of the race, even though there were no, as much as Buchanan was trying to raise money, and as much as he did raise some money, he just didn't have an apparatus in place to compete with that. And by the time you get to 2016, it wasn't so much that Trump did really well raising money. He didn't particularly, but there were so many outside spending groups there to kind of cushion him that there was no way for the party to use money to get rid of him either. He could kind of hang around. And if Pat Buchanan had hung around, he may well have won too, right? I mean, the appetite for, the same kind of racist and sexist and, anti-immigrant and with kind of like delivered with a puckish grin, like that was there then too. So I think it's obviously there are lots of other reasons the GOP is much more populist and radical than the GOP of 1996, but I think money is part of the story.
One of the figures that looms large in the Republican Party, both then and now, is Ronald Reagan. The ghost of Reagan is still with us in many ways in our political discourse. And one of the things I found so interesting in one of the chapters in your book is you talk about Reagan's pro-life position, but also the way that he talked about it, and particularly the way he talked about it with the court. So he, nominated and successfully nominated Justice O'Connor to be on the bench, and then she didn't necessarily come out with super strong anti-choice opinions, and so it really kind of shifted the way he started talking to voters, Republican voters, about the court and the role that justices that they should be selecting or not selecting really play into the way they should be voting. And so I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind telling folks a little bit about how that shift happened, what the case was, and kind of how it looked before and after that decision came down.
Yeah, so there was a big shift, I think, both in the anti-abortion movement and the Republican Party about how they talked about the court in the early 80s. And the case that makes it the most visible is a case called City of Akron versus Akron Reproductive Health Center from 83. And it was weird because at the time, Akron, Ohio was sort of like the center of the world when it came to abortion, which is hard to imagine. But all of the leading figures in the anti-abortion movement had convened to create this sort of model ordinance. And in this, it was passed in 78, and it kind of took forever to get up through the Supreme Court. But Reagan had been kind of, I think, figuring out how to talk about abortion and kind of have his cake and eat it too, because at the time he still wanted to nominate people who would get confirmed unanimously or not really have much pushback in Congress. He also wanted to kind of keep in his coalition social conservative voters who wanted from him something like a money back guarantee that his judges would be, in their view, pro-life, or that he would help promote a constitutional amendment banning abortion. And of course, that was a pretty difficult balance to strike, and it was a necessary one for him because the Republican coalition at the time was really fragile, right? This was when you first had really kind of a Republican get elected and have the kind of success Reagan had had since the New Deal, right? So keeping together this kind of fragile coalition of kind of anti-tax fiscal conservatives who may well have been pro-choice and social conservatives who are very much opposed to abortion was hard. And I think the Akron opinion really helped Reagan achieve that and helped the anti-abortion movement find a way to talk to Reagan and to the GOP. So O'Connor in the opinion essentially said, Roe is a bad opinion, Roe is unworkable, the trimester framework doesn't really make any sense, viability is incoherent. Didn't really say anything about what the anti-abortion movement traditionally said, which was things like the fetus is a rights-holding person, abortion is a violation of equal protection. They would invoke things like substantive due process, international human rights law, like what feels sort of like conventionally progressive doctrines, but used in a very not progressive way. And instead, she was saying essentially Roe is judicial activism. Roe is the courts making it up. And of course, Reagan liked that because he could say, I'm going to pick people who are not judicial activists. And he could say that in such a way that anti-abortion voters would understand him to mean, I'm going to get rid of Roe. But he wouldn't actually have to say that as much in ways that would be triggering for his fiscal conservative voters. And it gave the anti-abortion movement a way to talk that would be more comfortable and more legible, for example, for the Federalist Society and the conservative legal movement that had been deeply uncomfortable with the anti-abortion movement in its early years, right? The Federalist Society is just getting started in 82, but other conservative libertarian lawyers are not interested in talking to the anti-abortion movement at the beginning. The GOP was uncomfortable, but when everyone could kind of coalesce around this idea of judicial activism is bad and Roe is the ultimate example of judicial activism, it makes the partnership between the GOP and the anti-abortion movement run much more smoothly. And it also, I think, in interesting ways kind of obscures the fact that the anti-abortion movement was always about a nationwide ban and personhood. And that was never and is not something that polls well. And so it made it easy for the movement to kind of expand its popular appeal by essentially burying what was its foundational claim and the claim that still motivated the people who joined the movement ever since and today.
I want to ask a little bit about personhood before we kind of move forward in time, because personhood appears throughout your book, but it was noteworthy to me that you mentioned near the end, kind of bringing us to this current political moment. The personhood is where we kind of started in the first place. And it, as you mentioned, the language of it kind of gets buried because that's the way to keep the fragile coalition together. But personhood has always been the goal for a lot of the anti-abortion movement. And so I'm hoping you wouldn't mind describing both what personhood, the legal theory is, and also where we're looking like right now as personhood kind of comes back into the discourse post-Dobbs.
Yeah, I mean, so the book I'm writing now is about personhood. Like it's also with Yale, but when the movement, so I mean, there's an anti-abortion movement that was in the 19th century, but the personhood movement, like the modern anti-abortion movement, is a personhood movement. And it started in the 60s as soon as states began reforming the 19th century criminal abortion laws. And it was a little bit of a fallback argument. At the beginning, you would see anti-abortion lawyers saying, well, we don't need these laws because there's no such thing as medically necessary abortion because pregnancy isn't dangerous. Or, we don't really need rape or incest exceptions because no one who's been raped can actually get pregnant. And those sorts of arguments were just not working for unsurprising reasons. And so then you began to see members, and this was a predominantly Catholic movement at the time, members of clergy and lawyers saying essentially, well, whether you want legal abortion or not, it's unconstitutional because the word person in the 14th Amendment applies before as well as after birth. And that means that either abortion is a violation of the Due Process Clause, and more often they landed on abortion is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And so most of the time when you hear people invoke personhood, it's going to be about equal protection and claims of, discrimination. It's also interesting because, of course, to make an equal protection argument for personhood, you have to be upending how equal protection doctrine works, right? Because, does a fetus have an immutable trait? Like, no, right? Because they'll develop and eventually be born if they don't miscarry or there's no stillbirth. Is there a history of political oppression? Not according to people in the anti-abortion movement, right? They'll say that historically, as Dobbs said, like life has been cherished and protected. There's essentially the argument was what we really ought to be thinking about when we talk about equality is vulnerability and dependence, and all this other stuff, like you've had a history of being subordinated. That really, it turns out that doesn't really matter a whole lot. So that was the theory, and it wound up being incredibly resonant, both for the grassroots activists who began joining the movement. It wound up being really resonant for Protestants as well as Catholics. And so it became kind of like the founding doctrine of the anti-abortion movement, including, interestingly, for people who are not lawyers, right? This was something that really resonated across a lot of parts of the community. And it was the defining argument for the movement. It has always been, I would say. I think there was an era, like we were mentioning, after the 80s, when it was not palatable to talk about it publicly, and the most sophisticated anti-abortion groups did not. But if you're in the archives with their papers, they continue talking to one another about it the whole time. You began to get an even greater misunderstanding in the aughts and 2010s, because you began to see states like Mississippi passing state personhood laws, and you would have leading anti-abortion groups coming out against them. That was not because they didn't like personhood, it was because they thought that the Supreme Court, as it was then constituted, would invalidate those personhood laws. So it was essentially a timing question. But as soon as Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed to the court, there were lots of people in the anti-abortion movement who said essentially, it's a done deal, Roe is gone. And we have, in a lot of Republican states, essentially state legislators that are not really worried about general elections, that have no concern but for the fact that they might be primaried. And so we can pass more or less whatever laws we want, right? I mean, Republicans will work with us to do what we think is the best idea. And so you began to see personhood laws and arguments reemerge really forcefully. We see there's states like Arizona that have personhood laws. Georgia has a personhood law that starts at six weeks. Some anti-abortion groups are advocating the idea of a personhood executive order should there be a Republican president. The idea of personhood is fueling the campaign to punish women and other pregnant folks for abortion, which has had, has much more momentum than it has in the, I mean, really since the, maybe ever, right? I was going to say since the 19th century, but I may just say even then, I think has more momentum than it did then. So I think that it's still the movement's kind of raison d'etre, right? It's just a question of, and in some ways, the anti-abortion movement will almost inevitably continue fighting until there is something like a nationwide recognition of personhood. Like it's not going to be, they're not going to take their toys and go home just with the end of abortion rights.
One of the things that you talk about is, once Reagan is out of office and George H.W. Bush is, succeeds him, there's concern within some of the Republican operatives around Bush that we don't necessarily want to lose Roe because Roe has been a shield. Roe is a shield that kept him from having to have that conversation with anti-abortion activists and others in the coalition and keep them together. And to me, that struck me as something that was true for decades, that really it was the issue that they wanted, and not necessarily to have to answer, well, what comes next? But as you highlighted just a second ago, there are a lot of state legislators who are insulated from political accountability for a number of reasons laid out in the book, that are up to that question, that want to answer that question. How do we talk about post-Roe, and personhood is certainly a part of that conversation. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, George H.W. Bush was just like terrified of the possibility that it's funny to read his papers about that, because everyone in his, including some of the Federalist Society people in that administration, were like, "Oh Lord, please let the court not overturn Roe." So I mean, there definitely was a feeling in the GOP for a long time that that would be the dog catching the car. And I think there's an element of that now too. But I think, again, because of some of the changes the book talks about to the GOP, there is no one GOP anymore. And the GOP that was worried about the dog catching the car was the GOP that prioritized electability, right? Where the idea was that if a candidate has every position we love and is the most ideologically pure person imaginable and they can't win, we don't want that person there. And if an issue, or a Supreme Court decision delights a lot of our base and makes it harder for us to win, we don't want that, because this is about winning. And I think the contemporary GOP, kind of the GOP of Trump, is not entirely about that, right? I mean, that's the GOP that nominates, Herschel Walker through the primary process, notwithstanding the fact that he may not win, because it's not entirely just about that. So I think it's a big part of what's changed, because I think it makes, and again, it's kind of a stress test for democracy. We saw with ballot initiatives that even in conservative states, voters may want to have, a good number of abortions banned, but they see some of the laws that are being proposed, and including the ones that will be proposed in new legislative sessions, as too extreme, right? But if voters' opinions are not really what matters, then legislators can do whatever they want, right? And can do what they think will endear them to primary voters and donors, who often are pretty intensely opposed to abortion in certain conservative states. So the dynamic has changed in interesting ways. And I think there's been, relatedly, much as there has been a weakening of what we would have considered the GOP establishment, there's been a weakening of what I would consider the anti-abortion establishment. There's groups that were the sort of most sophisticated players in DC that had cultivated relationships with, with Congress, with the media, with state legislators for decades, right? To the point where if you asked an expert on this, what are the abortion laws we will see next year? You would literally look up, what are these one or two organizations pushing? Because that's what all the states were going to do. Now it's a free-for-all, right? And being associated with the traditional leadership or the establishment, that's a dirty word in the anti-abortion movement, much as it was with the GOP. And that too, I think, leads to the possibility of even more extreme legislation, because there's no one hierarchical entity running the GOP in the same way. There's no one hierarchical entity running the anti-abortion movement in the same way, which means you can see laws that would be a terrible idea for the National Republican Party, that would, lose them more elections, that'll get passed anyway, because the people in those states may think, it's not going to hurt us. Like, in my election in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, I got reelected resoundingly. Dobbs didn't bother me. So I think that creates some pretty out there possibilities in the state legislative sessions to come.
I'm aware of the danger of asking a historian to predict the future, but I'm curious, just based on the ways in which campaign finance laws have changed, really the way that people are elected and who is elected on both sides of the aisle. Do you see a group or two on the anti-abortion side re-emerging and taking that place and being that kind of consolidating force, or do you think that because of the structural changes that have been made, that it's unlikely that we get back to that place and it continues to be kind of spread out and amongst many different groups?
I think there are a couple different possibilities. I don't think we know yet which of these possibilities is going to emerge, right? So one possibility is that there's a new handful of organizations that become the kind of new establishment, right? And those could be either groups that have traditionally been influential, like an Americans United for Life or Susan B. Anthony list, that tack much further to the right to reassure especially younger activists that they actually are unwilling to compromise about anything involving abortion. And we see some signs of that happening. Another possibility is that a more extreme group, or a group that's like, for example, Students for Life is very powerful now on Capitol Hill. Students for Life, unlike some of the older generation of anti-abortion groups, is openly opposed to all chemical contraception, thinks the birth control pill is an abortifacient, is sort of, I think, more comfortable saying the quiet part out loud about a lot of stuff than some of the more traditional groups were. So there's a possibility that Students for Life, or an organization like it, becomes the kind of new top of the pyramid nationally. I think it's also possible that we see almost a sort of survival of the fittest battle about who comes up with the legislation that does the most to put people in jail for having abortions. SB 8 kind of emerged from that model, and the people who are behind SB 8 are kind of trying to be the new national leaders too. So some of that is in the way that they're proposing legislation across a lot of states. Some of it is in the way they're campaigning to ban abortion in communities, including in states where abortion is legal or even protected by law. And they also, I think the SB 8 crew kind of represents a possibility where there is no national organization dictating strategy, and each state is kind of looking to its own local activists for ideas and best practices. We saw some version of that happening in places like Georgia and Louisiana, where abortion bans there really didn't resemble abortion bans anywhere else, and they were inspired by local activists. I don't know which of those possibilities really is going to emerge at this point. Dobbs created a lot of chaos and uncertainty, obviously, in the lives of pregnant people, but it also did in movement circles, right? I think there's a lot of questions about, whose movement is this? What is this movement about? Is this movement going to be against IVF openly? Is this movement going to be against contraception openly? Is this movement going to be about for punishing pregnant people openly or not, right? And I don't think we know the answer to that question yet, because there are multiple voices offering different responses, and it's really unsettled from a social movement organization standpoint.
I'm curious what the answer might be to what are they going to continue to do in the campaign finance space? Because as you detail in the book, for so long, there was disagreement within the movement of whether or not this was a good tactic or not, but it was pursued by a number of key organizations. And obviously we had Citizens United, and that opened some floodgates. I'm going to ask a question that the book answers to tee it up, but did they stop there with Citizens United? What has the fight looked like on that front after that decision came down?
Yeah, the big focus has been dark money and donor secrecy, so like disclosure rules, disclaimer rules, and that in fact had been what BOP and folks in the anti-abortion movement had initially thought Citizens United might be. And I think a really foundational moment in the anti-abortion movement in this way was the Proposition 8 campaign in California. As some of you may remember, the California Supreme Court had recognized a right for same-sex couples to marry, and then social conservatives got a ballot initiative in 2008 that would reinstate bans on same-sex marriage, and it passed. And of course, it being California was incredibly controversial. And so California also has really expansive public records laws. So groups like knowthyneighbor.org popped up and would post online information about folks who had donated to the Prop 8 campaign. And that resulted in people, losing friends, losing business, sometimes even having, their houses graffitied or whatever. And so this experience, I think, was terrifying for people in the anti-abortion movement, because they saw the same polls everybody else did. And they realized that a donor who may be very strongly opposed to abortion may not be willing to sign their name to certain things, right? May not want their check being associated with certain ideas or certain laws. And so the more unpopular the policies people were willing to pursue, the more important it became to reassure donors that they could follow their beliefs without having to worry about their own Proposition 8 occurring, right? And so we saw, one of the kind of iterations of this, the Supreme Court decided, some of you may know Americans versus Prosperity versus Bonta, and the Thomas More Society versus Bonta. Thomas More Society, of course, is an anti-abortion organization that was very concerned about disclosure rules in California. So this was, I think, a continuation of this obsession. But I think there's been more of, a real interest in making sure that it's harder to figure out who's giving money for what, right? To kind of connect someone writing the check to the cause. That's been, I think, the focus in the years since.
I want to remind folks to ask questions in the Q&A box if they have them. There's one note in here that I'm going to pick up now that says you can't speak of the anti-abortion movement without mentioning Phyllis Schlafly, which is true. And we spent a good amount of time talking about Jim Bop, but lest anybody be confused, there were also women as part of the anti-abortion movement all the way through. And Phyllis Schlafly played a key role. So I'd love to ask you, what her impact has been on this particular question of the anti-abortion movement and campaign finance, and how she plays in.
Yeah, so Schlafly in the campaign finance story was sort of like Jim Bop's antagonist, right? Like, she was there the whole time saying, this is going to just help the GOP and this isn't going to help us. And like, why do you care about this? And she really didn't like, I don't know, that might not be fair, but when you get into her correspondence, she thought that the whole focus on campaign finance was a bad idea, and that it would cost the anti-abortion movement the support of politicians who were for campaign finance reform and against abortion. So she was, I think, kind of fighting a losing battle to keep the anti-abortion movement neutral on campaign finance. Schlafly as a figure in the anti-abortion movement generally is fascinating, because she was, I think, someone who helped to cement the anti-abortion movement's identity as socially conservative on all issues, right? The early kind of anti-abortion personhood movement was not politically diverse in some ways, right? Not on questions like sexuality and gender roles, but was in other ways, right? So, the idea of personhood early on was almost sort of like a Rorschach test, right? Where if you were sympathetic to the civil rights movement for Black Americans, or you thought that there needed to be better protections for poor people, the early arguments about personhood didn't really preclude your thinking that. And if you thought the civil rights movement was an assault on the rights of white Americans, or you thought that, the welfare state was an excuse for, lazy people to take advantage of the deserving, you could totally think that too. And Schlafly, I think, because Schlafly was, of course, America's most famous anti-feminist and opponent of the Equal Rights Amendment, Schlafly, as the more she identified with the anti-abortion movement, the more she worked with the anti-abortion movement, the more she made it, I think, identified with anti-feminism and with opposition to, lots of things, whether that was, daycare for low-income folks, whether that was rights for GLBTIQ people, like all of that. And so she was an important bridge figure. I think she obviously was a major figure in the anti-abortion movement, but I think she was kind of a latecomer who changed the movement from the outside. There was already a movement that existed when she burst onto the political scene, and I think she helped to kind of remake it in her image.
We have a question here asking about personhood. And so I'm going to ask it as a two-parter. And the first is, has personhood always fallen along political lines? Is that something that's always kind of classically fall to one party versus the other in terms of arguments pursued? And then the second part is, do you see any relationship between the movement for, what's called fetal personhood, and the movement towards saying that corporations are artificial people, and therefore have the right to speech? Is there a relationship there that's being made by the advocates who are oftentimes arguing both of these things?
Yeah, yeah, that's a fun question. I mean, no personhood didn't used to have the same political valence. And I think it's worth emphasizing, like, I mean, because I'm writing a whole book about personhood can mean a whole lot of different things, right? So there's this pretty funny poll, I mean, not funny, haha, but interesting poll that Americans United for Life, which is an anti-abortion group, did. And the top line they wanted you to take away was like, most Americans support fetal rights or support fetal protections. And then in the small print, they said, so like 80%, 70% of people think fetuses deserve protections. And then in tiny print, they were like, and like less than 50% support abortion restrictions. And so clearly there's this group of Americans thinking, yeah, I do value life in the womb. And like, there's some way I'd like to see the law express that. But then when you got into, and the expression is someone goes to jail for a very long time, a lot of people dropped out. And so I think there were times in the history of the personhood movement where there were real debates about like, well, if we have fetal personhood, how are we going to enforce that? Like, what does that mean? Does that mean you get an injunction? Does it mean stop the abortion from happening? Does it mean you have to have, better neonatal care and like financial support for pregnant people? Like, what is this actually going to look like in practice? And then I think in the 80s, again, during the Reagan years, the answer that really forcefully emerged, which was, I think they're both because of path dependence, because historically the default had been criminal enforcement, but also because this was the era of Reagan saying the way you give victims rights is by incarcerating people. Like, this was the era where Reagan is introducing the drug laws that produced mass incarceration. This is the era where you're seeing prison population spike, private prisons being constructed. And all of this, the argument about all of this is right, is this is recognizing the personhood of victims. And the anti-abortion movement in this era really picks up on this argument and runs with it. They helped to pass all these fetal homicide laws, which weren't on the books before. They helped you introduce prosecutions of pregnant people that were not really a thing before. So and I think they really settle into the idea that the way you recognize personhood is by punishing people. And that makes the politics of personhood very uncomfortable for people who are not on the political right. Again, I don't think that's inevitable, right? I think in other countries like that have abortion rights, they also talk about fetal rights in ways that I might not find comfortable, but that are completely foreign to the way we do it. I think the corporate personhood versus fetal personhood is really interesting because it sort of tracks this. So in the 60s and 70s, you would see anti-abortion lawyers saying, well, it's totally ridiculous that this corporation that is totally not a person is out here exploiting workers, gets to be treated as a person, and, produces drugs and all kinds of stuff that kills this poor little baby who's not treated as a person. So it was sort of used to, say, isn't this bananas that this is the way the law is working? And now I think that in the era, kind of the near Citizens United era, the arguments were kind of juxtaposed the other way, right? We're enlightened now that we see that corporations are persons. And so surely we can make the logical next step, which is to see that a fetus is a person too. So the arguments very much mirror how the movement and the politics of the movement have become more homogenous over time.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the ways in which a lot of the punishment has also shifted. For a long time, there was a narrative that women and other people who could be pregnant, who were getting abortions, were really kind of victims of the big abortion provider complex. And really, we've seen an uptick of laws and post-obs, the laws that go out of their way to punish the actual pregnant person who seeks care. It rates that are pretty high. And I'm wondering if you think that that's because of this shift post-Dobbs of, okay, like everything's on the table and we're pursuing anything that we can, or is that because of some legal shift that they're seeing? We should really go after the person who's receiving the care as opposed to the provider.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are probably three reasons we're seeing that. I think one is, the fact that legislators feel like they can do anything without consequences. Two is that the anti-abortion movement is fragmented, right? And so the voices of the people who call themselves abolitionists who think that pregnant people should be punished are easier to hear because there's no kind of single force telling everyone what to think. And then I think also there's almost a kind of, I think there's some reaction to things like shout your abortion. I've interviewed and heard things in the archive from people in the movement that people who are comfortable talking about or proud of the fact that they had an abortion are triggering for people in the anti-abortion movement who see those people as being people who are deserving of serious punishment, maybe even execution. And I think it's also kind of pragmatic in the sense that we're now at a time where most abortions take place by pill. And if you are fundamentally committed to not punishing pregnant people and women, that leaves you with scenarios where you have to punish out-of-state actors, you have to deal with things like the right to travel and due process and choice of law, and you have to be prosecuting random people for aiding or abetting. And so there's some voices in the movement saying, like, this is really simple. We can just punish the pregnant person who already lives in our state without all this drama about choice of law and constitutionality and SB 8 style bills. Like, why is this so hard? So I think there's an element of that too, that I think, again, the mainstream, like older established groups and even groups like Students for Life are very much saying they still don't want to punish women and pregnant people, but it's on the table in a way it's never been before. And I think I think it's going to be hard for them to hold that line for long, right? I mean, often you'll hear them saying things like, well, you know, we need to educate people, right? Because women and pregnant people don't know that they're murdering people. But sooner or later, the voices in the movement that are saying, like, do they still need more? Like, don't they know now? Can't we punish them now? I think it's going to be harder for people in the movement to ignore those voices over time.
Yeah. We have a question here that says, any thoughts on mitigating the actions of organizations like Christian Legal Society, which among other things recruits law students to conduct anti-abortion research? Are you seeing much movement kind of on the other side to empower law students to become part of the movement with the same energy, maybe?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I think, I mean, historically, if you're looking for like what really helps people build a movement and create a grassroots, there's almost nothing like losing in the Supreme Court, like much less having a right taken away. So, I mean, just even me personally, I've had like tons of people email me asking me if they can do research assistance work for me for free, right? I mean, there's tons of energy around this now. I think because people, you know, I mean, people took their rights for granted, right? It's with some reason, but now I think it's Dobbs has signaled to people that that you can't, right? Not just when it comes to reproductive rights, but when it comes to any right. And so I think it's mostly a matter of, you know, people who are, you know, young lawyers or even not in law school, but people who are just interested in this, finding kind of the best way to contribute, right? And that can be different for different people. Like I'm very much like, I mean, I do amicus briefs, so it's not like I don't do any advocacy, but I always was much more comfortable being the person who kind of tells you what's going on than an on the ground person. And I think I've made a contribution doing that. And so I think that's something I always tell my students, that if it's something you care about, you can also find a way to contribute that feels right to you. Like it's not one size fits all.
Next question is the religious rights issue brought up by non-Christian groups who claim that abortion restrictions adversely affect the religious rights going on anywhere?
I don't know. I mean, so I'm skeptical, right? Because I think, you know, I mean, as a historian, I'm a legal realist, so I think the Supreme Court has always been political up to a point and is clearly political now. So I think that if there is a way to distinguish those cases or make them go away on procedural grounds, this Supreme Court will find it. I think so I'm skeptical. I mean, I think it's designed to make the Supreme Court look uncomfortable and hypocritical, right? By essentially saying, you know, religious liberty, but not when we don't agree with the religious belief at issue. Historically, the way the court has gotten rid of those claims is largely based on things like standing, essentially saying, you know, this person doesn't have a close enough relation, like this person isn't pregnant and dying and their religion doesn't imminently mean that they need to get an abortion. Like they'll say sort of, you're too far removed. So I imagine that the first impulse that the courts will have will be that, essentially, to find a kind of procedural dodge. But I do think that it will force the court to confront the extent to which it's going to be consistent in its expansion with religious liberty. And that's in itself is a valuable thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question is about Catholic bishops' embrace of Senator Graham's bill. So I'm going to try and condense it a
Mhm.
little bit. Senator Graham has a bill which is essentially a 15-week ban,
Mhm.
and is being presented in some corners as kind of the compromise or moderate position.
Mhm.
And this person asked, do you see this bill as a significant threat, or is it more of is it accurate to call it a moderate position?
Well, I mean, within the anti-abortion movement, yeah, right. I mean, within the
Yeah.
anti-abortion movement, I mean, Lindsey Graham, this is like the best way to read this is like Lindsey Graham is not reading the room. Which room, you ask? Is it the anti-abortion room, the national political room? It's all the rooms. Like everybody
Yeah.
hated this. Like Republicans were like, dude, this is going to lose us elections. People in the anti-abortion movement were like, we're trying to ban all abortions from the moment of fertilization and like eliminate rape and incest exceptions. And you want a 15-week ban? Like you want us to care about a 15-week ban? And so from the standpoint of within the movement, it's not even moderate. It's like a lot of them may not think, I mean, some of them may think 15 weeks is better than nothing, but a lot of them may not agree with that, right? They may think
Yeah.
this is just a waste of time. And I think a lot of people in the anti-abortion movement and the people who support reproductive justice would look at this and say, like, Congress is not the place right now. I mean, Mitch McConnell could not be less enthusiastic about the idea of a 15-week ban if he tried, right? So I think the National Republican Party did see the result of the last election and feel worried about how Americans feel in supporting abortion. State Republicans didn't, I don't think, react that way. But I mean, I think of all the threats to worry about, that's pretty low on the list. And if anything, I imagine we may see dueling abortion bans come up in Congress, because there are going to be at least some and I've seen this. I've seen a lot of anti-abortion activists and lawyers saying, like, why is there not a personhood bill? Like, why is there not a 6-week ban? Like, why are Republicans not even like fighting for the stuff we say we want? So I think if anything, we're not likely, I don't think that bill is going to go anywhere. I don't really think any national ban is going to go anywhere in the near term. I think that would take, obviously it would take Republican control of the Senate, but it would probably take that and some, right? It would probably take more Senate Republicans who look like House Republicans who are not worried about general elections.
Yeah. I want to ask a question, which is, how has your book been received by groups on both sides? You've developed a relationship with folks in the anti-abortion movement to be able to tell their stories. I'm curious what their reception of your book has been.
I mean, to the extent I know, it's been generally positive. Like there's one or two people at the National Review who like really don't like me. So whenever I do anything, they'll have the thing be like, Mary Ziegler didn't know anything about anything. But Jim Bopp really liked it. But he called me without any kind of warning one day. And I was really worried because the book was out and I was like, oh no, I'm going to lose access to all this material because I said all these, not complimentary things. And he really is like, this is so great. I think it's really well done. It's really accurate. And Kristen Hawkins, who's the head of Students for Life, told me she's reading the book and really loving it. And so it's really striking to me just because of how polarized we are, right? Because I, in writing this, thought, my first obligation as a historian and a scholar is to tell the truth. And if that makes people look bad, it just is what it is. But I think what it showed me was that people so disagree about so many of these issues, including things like voting rights and campaign finance, that people didn't perceive this as me saying anything negative, right? They perceived this as, and I mean, I wasn't editorializing, like I wasn't intervening to say like, oh my God, this person sucks and this is so creepy. I was just telling the story. And I thought, to me, it spoke for itself that these were things that bothered me, but they didn't, right, bother a lot of other people. So I mean, it just goes to show that when you tell the story, right, when you relate the history, that people will really will respond in such radically different ways that kind of diagnoses something that's wrong with our politics, right? That people can feel that way.
We had another question come in that I think is actually a really nice way to sum up the substantive part of this talk, which is basically asking, is there a way to put it back in the box? So the question asks, do you think reform of campaign finance to enable spending and donation limits by constitutional amendment, and I'll add or other devices, would help to adjust the playing field to regain protection of abortion rights?
Yeah, it's really hard to say, right? So, I mean, there's this debate about, would it be better if there were like, better contribution limit, or like if it was basically all small dollar donors, the kind of Barack Obama model. And that may or may not work, right? I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene has sort of rode into office and stayed in office on the backs of small dollar donors. So sometimes the people who are the most extreme energize small dollar donors the most. And so I don't know. I mean, if you went back to a kind of system of public financing, that might help. I don't know if that would put. So I mean, this is being a historian, I'm always reluctant to give you kind of clean solutions, because my brain is like, it's complicated and messy. There's no easy
It's a
answer.
fair answer.
So I mean, I'm skeptical that anything would cleanly work, but I think the most important first step is in realizing that you can't do the thing I've had a lot of people do until recently in my career, which was essentially to say, we don't really need to worry about all this reproductive stuff. Like, that's y'all's thing. Like, we're going to focus on the glamorous stuff like voting rights. And increasingly, I think what people didn't realize is that the fight to get rid of reproductive rights matters so much to people who disagree with you that they're willing to change anything, right? They're willing to change what the Constitution means on any point. And so I think it helps as a first step to see that these things are interconnected, but I don't know. I mean, I think, public financing of elections would help, but I'm not enough of a campaign finance expert, and I'm also a skeptic because I'm a historian that there'd be a clean fix that would solve a lot of the issues.
Well, I think first step is knowing how we got here, knowing kind of the changing of the rules that you mentioned, the anti-abortion movement has taken on this front in particular. And so for anybody who's watching and hasn't finished their holiday shopping yet, or is looking for an appropriate way to mark the 50th anniversary that we're going to have next month, I strongly encourage you to pick up a copy of Dollars for Life if you have not already. It is so informative, accessible. It is just truly an incredible document to understand exactly the pieces that got moved into place to kind of lead to the result that we saw this past term. And so I cannot encourage people strongly enough to go and pick up a copy. And I'm so thankful, Professor Ziegler, for your time and sharing your insight and experience with us, because this has been truly a pleasure to get to talk with you today.
Yeah, no, same. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining. Stay tuned with ACS. We will continue to have book talks throughout the year. So keep an eye on your inbox and on social media. And thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.